one of the problems we have with journalism, I think, is that a lot of the different beats that we think about, because journalism is struggling, the positions aren't filled. And it really becomes important to have like someone on the schools beat and the science beat and the religion beat, all this. But from a journalist perspective, I think in some ways that's less important now, because I think the stories that need to be told tend to be across so many different issues. And I think in your case, with the first book that you wrote, which was strictly speaking maybe about disease, but ended up involving so much more, that as a journalist, it's not enough, if you want to be a science journalist, for example, to just know science.
I think science journalism is special because you do need to know something about science.
You do.
Science, there's all kinds of science journalists. Some have degrees in science and they write specifically about science. If they are interested in physics, then they can write about the cosmos, right? Interested in biology and germs. I'm insanely interested in germs. So I like microbiology. Having a little bit of that background, you don't need a PhD, but
right.
You need to know the language of science to understand what scientists do, how they talk, and to have some context for what they say. So I would say for one of the things that's happening in journalism is that the science writing positions are being eliminated. Right. It's happened at the big legacy news outlets. But what they're finding is when you take an education reporter and ask them to write about Ebola or malaria, you do end up with mistakes, because in the Washington Post I read that global warming could bring malaria back to the United States. I was in the Washington Post. I'm not going to name their journalist, but she wasn't a science writer. And you need to understand the way malaria works to know that that's impossible.
Right.
As long as we have the CDC and a really strong public health infrastructure, malaria will never return to this country no matter what the temperature is. We have malarial mosquitoes here now, and we have the temperature for malaria now, but we have a really strong public health system that identifies an infection as soon as it hits the ground. That infection is isolated and it never gets anywhere. So to say that global warming would have a play in bringing back diseases to this country, you really have, it's disease specific and you have to know what you're talking about. Right.
But that's sort of the point, that you need to have a broader perspective than just your beat. In this case, they were stretching someone, like an education reporter becoming, or...
I don't know that she was an education reporter.
But whatever. But yeah, so do you... And your background is not entirely just in science journalism.
Oh, no.
Also, you were a writer for many years before that.
Well, I was a political reporter. I covered Congress for a big Texas newspaper. So, and I executive offices, and I did White House duty. So, yeah, I mean, I got a taste for science journalism when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I was asked to cover small towns out in South Jersey because I was a cub reporter. And I loved going to those town hall meetings where there were 30 people in the audience and everybody knew each other and they talked about the problem of moles in the golf course. But I wanted to write bigger stories. And it happened that my little towns were in the Pine Barrens. And there were a bunch of science stories, water quality, air quality, really good science stories there. And so I started writing about the Pine Barrens instead, and started working with scientists as my sources, and enjoyed that very much. And then I came to Washington and covered politics, and I learned that I like scientists better than I like politicians. So I went back to science writing.
I'm just curious about the Pine Barrens. Was it there were a lot of science stories there because they particularly had issues, or because they had a community that was talking about and dealing with the issues?
Well, the Pine Barrens are a special ecosystem.
Yeah.
The New Jersey has 1 million acres protected by the federal and state government, because underneath it are 17 trillion gallons of the cleanest water on earth that the state relies on for residential drinking water. Mm-hmm. So the law that protects those 1 million acres allows some development, but it's very nuanced in what's allowed and where it's allowed. So there are a lot of pressure. I mean, imagine the Pine Barrens are in between Philadelphia and New York City, right? And along the Northeast Corridor, one of the most busy, most populated parts of the country in the most densely populated state in the country. And there, in the middle of it, is 1 million acres that are hardly touched.
Right.
So there are a lot of the science behind what is allowed to go there is interesting in itself. But then what development in general is doing to the Pine Barrens in terms of changing the ecosystem is also studied. And when there's a study, there's an opportunity for a story. But because I started doing those stories, then my editors would be like, all right, well, the state's working on a water quality problem, upstate. Can you cover that? There's a big bill coming into the State House about air quality. Can you go cover that? So it sort of led me into this environmental beat.
And as journalists, as newspapers and news organizations around the country shrink, they're less likely to have someone like you or someone who has experience in other areas.
The interesting thing about this, though, is that Pew in 2017 did a study of what readers were interested in. And they found that news consumers are, number one, interested in local news. Number two, science news. Number three, political news. Number four, business news. Number five, sports news. And number six was entertainment news. So news organizations are interested in having good science news because they have the readership there interested in it. And some places, even as they're seeing their editorial numbers shrink, they are actually seeing a little tick up in the number of people who can write about science because they know that they'll get the hits when they put the stories out there.
But just the impression that one would get from looking at some news organizations is that level of priorities in some ways seems to be flipped. Is that the entertainment and the sports, maybe they seem to have more resources toward that?
No, I don't think they have more. The national desk will be where the most resources are at a big legacy paper. Right. And so where do they focus? The editors are all sitting around a big table deciding what the lead stories are going to be. And that's where you see a little bit of a shift. Climate change is now an important big story for these national editors, whereas a couple of years ago, 5-10 years ago, something about an environmental story would belong on the science page, back when science pages still existed. Fortunately, the New York Times still has the Science Times. But a lot of those big science stories break out onto the front page, and you'll see that, I think, it's anecdotal. I can't say for sure. I don't know if anybody's done a study of it, but it seems to me that you find a lot more of those big science stories out on the section fronts now, instead of isolated, instead of siloed in the science sections.
So I've been starting to do some of this in conversation, but on the Green New Deal in Virginia, and immediately people have been talking about a real need to get more information about the science behind it all, behind climate change, and explain and get the information in ways that they can understand, because they're not going to, in fact, they can become a scientist, but they need media to do a better job of relating it to them so they can decide what to support, decide what to oppose. Right.
I think that's absolutely right. And the interesting thing about Pew also, another study found that even though people get most of their science news from mainstream news sites, they tend not to trust it. Fortunately, they trust it more than they trust social media when they get a posting on science. But I think rightly so, the legacy news outlets have a bad reputation for handling the science accurately. So you've got to go to Science or Nature. The outlets that actually rank highest in evidence-based research and readability, I'm thinking of the graph here, are Science, Nature, Smithsonian, Ars Technica, The Economist gets stuff pretty right and is easy to read. The Guardian does pretty well. The Atlantic does really well. Where do you see the Washington Post, the New York Times, other news outlets kind of over here where they don't use as much evidence and they're not quite as readable. So I'm not saying that the people who get their science news from news outlets will read science, but those publications are available, and as interest in science increases, I think those news outlets are seeing more and more traffic.
So with the news outlets you identified as having a little more trouble, the science right. Is part of that science itself spreads more different aspects of society? I've heard people in law enforcement talk about how when they recruit officers now, they kind of need the officers to have an understanding of science because so much of the work they're going to be doing is based on testing and forensics. And so the science itself is getting into more places in society, and it's for a paper that is covering society, they might not have that capability on staff. You think is that fair to say?
What do you mean? I'm not clear what you're trying to say.
You're talking about some of the news organizations that don't quite get it right. Is it because they need time to catch up and get more reporters?
I think it's episodic, right? So it depends. If you've got somebody who you can put on that science story who has enough background to get it right, then you do fine. If that person is somewhere else and you need to grab the education reporter to go do the story, then you tend to get it wrong. So they're a real mixed bag.
Right.
Whereas you go to the front section of Science or the front section of Nature,
right.
Their front sections are all science news. Those science journalists will tend to have PhDs in the science that they're asked to cover. And so you get solid science with them. Now, the flip side is they're maybe not as accessible to, say, a high school student. You need a college degree or more to get through the stories and understand them.
Right. But do you think that can be something that the editors could do a better job at some of those publications of making it more accessible?
Well, it's tricky for them because a large part of their audience, too, are scientists, right, with PhDs.
Right.
And so they try to strike a balance. I think Nature tries very hard to be more readable. And Science is, I find readable, but I don't find them as readable. I don't find their stories as readable as Nature's, for example, right? But you go to Smithsonian or you go to the Atlantic, those stories are absolutely readable, and they tend to get the science right according to this study that I'm referring to.
Right. So how long have you been teaching science journalism?
Let's see, I've been since 2011.
So a while.
Yeah. So I actually taught public health students at Johns Hopkins how to write, and I used journalism to teach that. Now I'm teaching for a journalism school, teaching science writing to aspiring journalists. And
we should be clear, a lot of when we're saying science journalism and science writing, all that, that's broad, including health topics, and it's the whole, right. So the typical students that you have, I think undergraduate, do many of them come in and are fulfilling a requirement for the degree?
They take my class and I make them learn science writing.
I know.
I teach journalism. Well, that's what I'm saying.
Do you make a pitch to them, like, here's why you should be a science journalist?
I talk about how fun science journalism is, how interesting it is, and how every story grows your world. You learn something new. You become smarter and feel more confident in who we are. I mean, what is science? It tells us who we are, what we are, why we are, where we are, right? It's basic. And then I talk about how much easier it is. Because most stories, if you read them, they're off of a study. Something came out, right?
Right.
You have to be craftier. You can't put the study in the lead, otherwise you lose readers. But most of the stories that come out about science are driven by something that hit the science news, right? And if you're going to mainstream it, you've got all these opportunities and choices because there's so much science being produced every day.
Right. But there's still, connecting it to the community.
Right.
And there's still that humanizing it that a good journalist has to do. I mean, it's still that.
But you're right. You got to have beating hearts. There has to be an interesting character.
Or how does this impact? How does what's going on in the Pine Barrens impact the people who live next door?
Right.
I guess I was wondering, in the years you've taught science journalism, are you finding it easier for a typical student to want to be a science journalist? Are you sensing a trend at all?
When I was it's the student body that makes a difference. When I was at Hopkins, I had students who really had no idea that they even wanted to write. They were taking the class as a requirement, and by the end of it, they were really interested in writing about science and writing about science for mainstream publications. At Stony Brook, the School of Journalism there, I have students who are afraid of science. They're in the J school. A lot of, like, the boys come in, they want to be sports reporters, and some of them want to be political reporters. A lot of the young women want to cover fashion and entertainment and the arts.
Right.
I mean, it's these typical gender breakdown, kind of ideas about what they want to do, and they're young, and so all of the journalism professors are there to break them out of those kinds of constraints that they come to the program with. And my specialty is breaking them out into science. And they are afraid, but I've turned a lot of students interested in science, which makes me happy.
Right, because these things tend to spill over. They tend to be, I mean, if you're going to cover football well, you have to cover concussions and injuries well, and you need to know the science behind how to do that. So in the same way, you need to know the political context with athletes now getting more involved in social protests.
Right.
If you can't cover that well and understand that, you're not going to do a job as a sports reporter.
Right, exactly.
So you need...
You could come teach a course. That's exactly what we tell our students.
All right.
I mean, they're young. They're undergraduates, right? So they're young.
They still don't, So are they better... You've been there a while. Are they, in general, you think they're better prepared coming out of high school? What's your sense, just in general, from your institution?
So I went from Johns Hopkins, top 10 private university in the country, to a public university in New York. Stony Brook is a STEM university. It's an R1 research university. It's excellent in a lot of ways, but it's a public university. And so the expectations that I brought to the classroom had to shift. And my first year there, I found my expectations had to shift substantially. But I see our students are coming into the program better and better qualified, and I think that's because there's just more competition to get in. I don't think it has to do with preparation in school. I think unfortunately, schools do not prepare students to write. They certainly don't prepare students to write for broad audiences. They do prepare them for science. I mean, our students have a decent background, basic background in science when they come in.
Right.
And coming to a university like Stony Brook, which is a STEM university, they generally know the basics at least.
And it's sort of like the typical high school curriculum anywhere in the United States. It's already kind of crowded. There's a lot the students do. But it sounds like it might be a good thing if less standardized tests and more emphasis on writing and more just to prepare students better for whatever the next thing they're going to do in life.
Yeah, I would think. I don't know. I mean,
that's a bigger question.
I'm not a high school educator, but I am a parent of kids who are going through school, and I do worry about the focus on standardized tests.
Right.
Because it's not teaching critical thinking. It's one of the things that we do. So even though we're a school of journalism, we see ourselves as an institution of liberal arts. We are teaching our students how to be critical thinkers, how to be skeptical news consumers, how to be thoughtful, how to bring context to the topics that they want to write about, which requires research and a broader understanding of everything. We read the news every day, not for the breaking news, but for the larger lesson in civics. I mean, there's so much you can get just from the newspaper in terms of liberal arts education. So that's actually how we see ourselves as journalism professors. And science, to me, is an important part of a liberal arts education, as odd as that may sound. Right.
And and some people obviously can handle a more rigorous science class in college or high school better than others, but there's a lot of science that can be taught not at the highest sort of rigorous level. There's still an understanding. I was going to say, so one of the things that is true is that most, depending on how you measure it, scientific literacy concept can be nebulous, but fewer than half of Americans probably pass most tests for scientific literacy, as measured by surveys and different studies and things. Is science journalism the key to raising that, or is that putting too much on the journalist?
Well, It's logical, right? If
Right.
more and more people are interested in science news, and we have science journalists doing a good job with that news, then science literacy should go up.
Right.
Right? I mean, Pew just came out with another one of their studies. It was a few months ago. It was earlier this year about science literacy, and most of us get about a C.
Yeah.
Which is barely a passing grade, right, on science.
Right. And I would be more worried also about the people that are below the C, the large percentage of people who are below the C, and not having to be too concentrated up in the top end of the grading scale. But are you hopeful about the future of science literacy in America?
Of course.
Is that because you're
I'm
hopeful?
a hopeful person.
Is that because you're hopeful? So you're not hopeful based on like your students, or maybe you are. I don't know.
Oh, my students give me so much hope for the future because they are they are angry about what our generation has done to the planet, and they take seriously the science news that they read about climate change. This is where general interest in everyday life meets science, because it's now what they are taught from elementary school through high school, the problem of plastics, for example. And then they see grown-ups drinking out of plastic water bottles, and they're like, what is wrong with you? And these are conservatives, politically conservative students and politically liberal students.
Right.
They are taking a pragmatic look at what they're being handed, and they're upset. And that's what gives me hope, actually.
So you have colleagues who are political journalists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure they're conveying that story.
They're trying. I think that...
Because the story is usually that on climate change, we're politically divided, and that's one of the sad things. But from what you're saying is that's not necessarily true, certainly not in this upcoming generation. You find a lot of students who are...
the politics of climate change are complicated, aren't they? Yeah.
They are.
But the science of climate change is quite clear. And I think that the next generation coming up behind us are much more cynical about politics because of what they're seeing right now, and they should be.
Right. That's a good point.
And so that's a nice combination of things to be happening in a young person's brain as they grow into adulthood, right? As their frontal lobe finishes developing, they've got a healthy skepticism about politics, and especially what's going on in Washington. And they see the condition of the planet in a way that's really interesting. They wouldn't see that if it wasn't for science journalism. Right.
Is there much of a difference between science communication and science writing? Science journalism?
Well, there is. In fact, the Stony Brook University School of Journalism is affiliated with the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, and we have a lot of cross-pollination faculty-wise, which is very interesting because what we do as journalists is what journalists do. We challenge the positions of power. We ask questions, and we don't necessarily know the context. We might not have the science quite right, but we're asking questions because we're journalists and we want to know the answers. Science communication is the other side of that.
Right.
It's the scientists, and it's the people behind the scientists and the people out in front of the scientists getting as much information to science writers and science journalists in a clear way so that that information can be used to be delivered to the public. So there's a big difference, but what I talk about with my students is not everybody can be a journalist. Journalists are cut from a certain cloth, and students come into journalism maybe because they don't want to be a biology major because they think science is hard, right? Like students come to journalism for all kinds of reasons, and most of it is because they like to write, they like to communicate, and so another emphasis that I make in science journalism teaching is that science communication is another way, if you're interested in science, to become a communicator. And it's actually a very important part of science journalism to have good science communicators on the other side. There's a cluster of scientists, I'm going to get this mostly right, but it happened a while ago. There's a cluster of scientists who were furious with some science journalists because they got a story wrong, right? And they did what scientists do. They tested themselves. So they went back and they looked at the story that they were so upset with, and then they went to the press release that was out front of the study that the science journalist was writing about. And the original injury, the original point of inaccuracy was actually in the press release. And so this little cluster of scientists did a bigger look. They took on, I forget how many examples of inaccuracies in science journalism, and they researched the original documents that were given to the journalists for background information, and found that 80% of them had the original injuries, had the original inaccuracies in those press releases. And so this is something that the Alan Alda Center thinks a lot about. How can we train the actual scientists to be out front? Because what happens is you don't have the PhD writing the press release.
Right.
And it would be much more accurate if the PhD could write that press release. But that's usually not in their skill set. And so to get them to be able to communicate better and directly with science journalists is a way towards more accuracy in journalism.
And that's just not in their skill set. It's often not in their sort of reward system.
Exactly.
They're there, they get rewarded by writing a great research proposal, not the communication that comes out.
Right.
And so, and it's not like they're sitting around with nothing to do.
Right.
So, yeah. So are they going to do it? Are they going to pull that off? Are they going to get them more directly involved?
Well, that's what they're working. The Alda Center is working all over the country. They work with the National Science Foundation. They work with universities, PhDs all over the country. He has this method that is drama-oriented. He puts scientists up on stage, and he has them talk to each other, but there's an audience over there, and then they turn to the audience, and they ask, did that make sense? And the audience is sitting there scratching their head saying, no, we have no idea what you just said. And then they practice it again. They practice talking to each other in a way that's more accessible. And I hope I'm getting it right. I've not taught in the center. I've not been trained in the method, but it's something along those lines. And they convinced the scientists that it's important to use regular language, because a lot of scientists don't have time for it, or they don't know how to use regular language that average people who don't have PhDs can understand. And they've found some great success. I can't cite their studies, but they're out there and they've been published.
Are science typically, are they quibblers about language? Because they like to get things right? Is that part of their problem? Like they can't communicate necessarily to the audience because it has to be said this way, because this is...
Precision is really important.
Precision is important.
There's a great guy who wrote children's books about physics, and I wish I could remember his name, but he did a TEDx talks, and in it, he talked about physics, and he used this great imagery to help regular people understand physics. And then he said something that really resonated with me. He said, it is not so important when you're a physicist communicating to the public that you get everything exactly right. It's more important that you get it kind of right in a way that regular people can understand. And I think that's a really hard lesson for scientists. I think scientists would rightfully be resistant to that, but I also think it's a really good way to think about communicating. You're not, as a scientist, you don't want to intentionally get things wrong, but if you have to step away from precision for a moment so that the audience can understand, then you're doing a public good, you're doing a public service.
You want to get the concept right, and then also the details right. So I have to go back, because I read this history a while ago, but one of my favorite sort of moments during the American Revolution was when General George Washington, in winter camp, all the stresses that involved. I mean, he, had no money for leading an army. He had a visitor, and they took time out and they went on this sort of expedition down to a river to do an experiment involving gases, because he had a scientific interest, even in the midst of all this going on. So I always like that, because it strikes me that this side of inventiveness and curiosity and this whole scientific approach, it's very human, but just as much, it's also very American, I think. And I'm not sure everyone in our current political climate understands that.
Well, Ben Franklin was an incredible scientist.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson was an incredible scientist. If you were an educated person, you understood science because it was such an important part of your education, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not as much anymore. I'm not sure. No.
I agree. Well, hopefully the science journalists will change that.
In theory.